My parents suddenly appeared and started banging on the car window. "Dad, did someone ask you to do something?"
Well, what do you mean?
You're always so stubborn. Just be quiet and convince John. Tell him he should step down because the chairman prefers his own father. Otherwise,
I see these people had teamed up with my in-laws to kick my husband John out of the chairman's position. And then I noticed my mom was holding something like a crowbar. And as she raised it high, crash, the window glass shattered with a loud noise. I was told that a suicide note was found in John's car that had fallen off a cliff, and I was stunned for a while. However, a week after the car was found, a letter arrived with a specified delivery date. "John?" In a panic, I took the envelope and opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter and a key.
Read this without our parents finding out.
Of course, I understood that. Even so, he probably wanted to write it that way.
This is something I prepared in advance in case something happened. If I'm there when you receive it, just laugh and give it back to me. But if I'm not, please, Mary, take what's in this locker and run to my uncle.
Reading it, my sister-in-law, Lydia, and I looked at each other. And we immediately took the minimum necessities and ran to Uncle Ken's house. To protect myself and my children, and to make known what our parents had done. My name is Mary Smith, 34 years old. Just an ordinary housewife, or at least that was me until a week ago. Now, I'm a widow with 2 children. My husband, John, took his own life, or so I was told, as that's the most likely possibility. His car had fallen off a cliff, and they say a suicide note was found in the dashboard. I don't believe it. I can't believe it. After all, there's no reason for him to take his own life. In fact, John and I met at work. It was a resort hotel affiliated with a real estate company, a job I had always dreamed of. As a child, I was captivated by a large and beautiful hotel where my parents' friends had invited us. I chose a university that taught important things for the tourism industry. And during my student days, I chose part-time jobs at nearby hotels behind the scenes. And finally, I got a job at my dream resort hotel. It was a place with very strict employee training, and I almost gave up early on. What kept me going was the support of a senior employee at that time. When 1 or 2 people couldn't endure and left, the person who stayed and watched over me. That was John Smith, who later became my husband. We dated for 2 years before getting married, but I was surprised by the fact I learned at that time. John was the nephew of the chairman of this real estate group. He would eventually become a member of the upper management of the group, but at that time he was still training as an employee at a resort hotel. After our marriage, he moved from the hotel to real estate and started appearing at his uncle, the chairman's place. Originally, this group was a local real estate business, but it grew significantly after the war. The current chairman, Ken, is the 2nd generation since the group was formed, and his skills greatly contributed to its development. Thanks to convincing his parents during the bubble economy, they suffered little when it burst. After that, he dabbled in resort development, and that too progressed steadily. However, since the current chairman fell ill last year, things around him have become suspicious. This is because Ken had no biological heir. At this point, Ken designated John as his successor, and this decision shortened John's life. I was stunned and could hardly accept the news from the police that John had lost his life. At such a time, my in-laws kept calling incessantly.
Mary, something terrible happened to John.
Something terrible. How can they summarize their son's situation with such simple words?
Hey, Mary, it must be tough for you alone. Come to our place.
With John gone, it will be tough financially too, right?
John's father, Bob, and his mother, Anne, took turns saying such things. I felt anger rising at their words, and I just said, I can't really think about the future right now, and hung up the call. What are they thinking now? After all, I've only met these in-laws twice. Once when we reported our marriage and on the day of the wedding. They didn't even show their faces when our son and daughter were born. Yes, John avoided his parents, my in-laws. John once told me when I questioned their attitude at the time of our marriage.
They're worthless, refusing to work at all.
John's parents currently hold a position within the Smith Real Estate Group.
But that's just to keep them from doing anything.
John explained about his parents to me. Apparently, unlike the skilled Ken, everything they did backfired on the group.
So, Uncle Ken gave them decorative titles to keep them from moving around too much. They just go on so-called inspection trips.
Then didn't they take you along to show you around? No way, John snorted.
Both Lydia and I were always left alone in that big, empty house.
John has a sister named Lydia. She married a man who has a completely unrelated job to the group and lives in the city where he works. This brother-in-law, Adam, got along very well with John. When he was nearby for work, he would go out of his way to talk to John. Lydia would say about these men, I'm jealous of my brother. Yes, these siblings have a good relationship. And both of them had a strained relationship with their parents.
But well, I'm fine. Once I got married and moved away, I didn't care about them.
Lydia was straightforward about it.
But John is involved with the group.
So what?
Our parents know their failures in the group, so they hate seeing John doing well.
Is that so?
That's how it is with us. But your family is different, right, Mary?
Not at all. Yes. I also don't have a good relationship with my parents. Well, we were close when I was a child. As their only daughter, I thought I was loved in my own way. But their true nature showed when I was in college.
Drop out of college and come back home.
I suddenly received that message. The reason was an arranged marriage. When I was just over 20, they tried to call me back for that reason. Apparently, the son of a local dignitary noticed me when he returned home. He insisted he wanted me, and my parents decided to fulfill his spoiled wish for their own benefit.
After raising you so well, you should show some gratitude to us.
I felt my image of my parents crumble. They raised me with the expectation of a return on their investment. When I realized that, I flatly refused to go home. Then, the transfer of my tuition and living expenses was stopped. They must have thought I would return if they did that. But I stubbornly refused to go back. I consulted my professor and looked for ways to continue my studies without being taken back by my parents. From then until graduation, I was desperate. I managed to cover my tuition by applying for scholarships. The problem was living expenses. I moved out of my secure studio apartment, sold off unused furniture, and moved into an old apartment. After that, I spent my days attending college, working part-time, and job hunting. I only went back to my room to sleep. As a result, this part-time job experience led to employment and meeting John. And my parents were strangely happy about my marriage to John.
Don't you have great parents?
John said, comparing them to his own. No, they found out. They knew you were the nephew of the chairman of a real estate group. For a while, John didn't believe it. But when our son Nate and daughter Emily were born and my parents came to visit, John realized they weren't much different from his own parents. After all, my parents said,
Wow, with 2 kids, your future is secure.
Yes, indeed. Our lives will be easier too.
At that moment, John's smile twisted slightly. Both John and I were sensitive to the words spoken by our parents. Especially John, who knew about the hardships I endured during my college years. Maybe my parents let their guard down a bit, or maybe they just thought it was natural. Either way, it was clear they intended to leech off us and our children in the future. After that, John also started to be wary of them. Distant in-laws and overbearing parents trying to get involved. I raised my children while being cautious of both sides. Fortunately, with John's current position and salary, we could afford to hire a housekeeper or a babysitter. We had no trustworthy relatives, but we managed together. However, last year, the situation changed. Ken fell ill. Ken, still in his 60s, was always physically active and seemed to be the picture of health. He was fit, and I had heard that his blood pressure and other health indicators were fine. However, a head injury from his youth had developed into a hematoma that was now pressing on his brain. An emergency surgery saved his life, and his recovery was good, with no lasting effects. But at this time, the group was shaken because a successor had not been chosen. Ken probably thought he could keep going and didn't see the need to choose one. But illness strikes suddenly. Knowing this, he had to consider his successor. The issue then was who that successor would be. Ken and his wife had no children. At this point, there were no biological or adopted children. So while recovering, Ken designated John as his successor. Within the group's various companies, this was considered a reasonable decision. Most senior employees knew that John had been training within the group and receiving executive education. However, there were some people who just couldn't accept it. It was John's parents.
Wait a minute, Ken. John is still young. I'm the closest to you.
That's right. Why John over him?
They apparently confronted Ken while he was recovering. Ken reportedly rebuked them sharply.
If I leave it to you, the group will collapse.
He then explained in detail why he chose John. But then their anger turned towards John. They told him to decline, saying he was too young and should let his parents take over. It was clearly a threat. Initially, they said, please, but it gradually turned into, do something or else.
This is getting dangerous.
What do you mean?
If we leave them alone, they might harm me, you, and our kids.
What? I initially thought they wouldn't go that far.
They will.
John spat.
I've never considered them my parents. They don't see us as their children. No, they only see children as tools to generate profit.
That's the same for my parents.
No,
John shook his head.
your parents are bad, but mine are worse. Your parents still want to hang on to profits, but my parents want to take the profits entirely.
What should we do then? The word take sent a chill down my spine. The family filled with love and trust that we had finally achieved. I don't want anyone to get hurt.
I have an idea. First, I'll make sure the apartment manager is vigilant about any suspicious people. Mary, you need to protect our kids when you go outside.
Can I handle it by myself?
I'll arrange for a security company through my uncle. They'll discreetly guard you when you go out.
I answered, okay. From then on, I chose crowded places whenever I went out with the kids. I also started actively participating in gatherings with other moms, which I usually avoided. I figured it would be harder for anyone to make a move if we were in a group. But even so, there was an attempt to take my children. The first time was at the park where we were playing with everyone. I was talking with other moms, watching the kids. A plump, middle-aged woman who seemed to be just walking by suddenly picked up my daughter and started running. The security guard, who had been watching discreetly, quickly intervened. However, the woman trying to abduct my daughter escaped with surprising agility for her size. In the end, we never found out why or who she was. People just kept saying, "It's a scary world nowadays. We all need to be careful." We recognized the need to be cautious of both financial motives and pranks. However, I overlooked one thing.
Hey,
I ran into my parents in the apartment parking lot. It was right after I had taken the kids out shopping and was getting out of the car. Panicking, I rushed back into the car and locked the doors. My parents started banging on the car window hard.
Mom, why are Grandpa and Grandma doing this?
I'm scared.
I opened the window just enough to fit my fingers through and asked my parents. I didn't want to open it at all, but I couldn't talk to them with it closed. "What do you want?"
oh, you finally opened it. Hey, Mary, can you ask John for a favor?
"What?"
Look, it's not right for someone as young as John to become the next chairman. It's out of order, don't you think?
A chill ran down my spine. Could it be that these people... Dad, did someone ask you to do something?
Well, what do you mean?
My dad feigned ignorance. And my mom.
You're always so stubborn. Just convince John to step down and say the chairman prefers his own father. Otherwise,
My mom was holding something like a crowbar. Then she raised it high, crash. The window shattered with a loud noise. The kids screamed and cried. My mom reached her hand through the broken window. "Get down!" I shouted to the kids and honked the horn repeatedly to signal the security guards who should be nearby. Soon, I heard several men running towards us.
Damn it!
My parents clicked their tongues and quickly fled, getting into a nearby car and driving away. "Are you okay?" the security guards asked us. "I'm fine, but the kids."
We're okay.
Nate answered loudly. Even so, shards of the window had rained down on them. "I'm heading back to my house now. Please escort us to the entrance." The security guards agreed and escorted us. The manager was also shocked by what happened and promised to be extremely vigilant against intruders. That night, I told John about it. My own parents, of all people.
Yeah, they probably got roped in. Maybe promised a good position if they helped my parents become chairman.
It's possible. Why are our parents all like this?
This is getting serious. I'll go to my uncle and ask him to shelter you and the kids for a while.
To Ken?
We'll need to do it without drawing attention. Also, I'll contact Lydia and ask her to stay with you guys for a bit.
But won't that bother her?
Given the situation, it's better to join forces. They might think Lydia, being of the same bloodline, could be involved too.
John immediately contacted Lydia.
I can't believe it. Those people. Okay, I'll join you. What about Adam?
Adam has work, right?
Yeah, but I'll talk to him. We'll figure it out.
Thanks.
It's times like these that having siblings is a blessing, I thought. Lydia came over the next day.
I told Adam and he said he'll join us later. He has something he wants to look into.
Really?
Adam is dependable.
Of course he is. I chose him.
We laughed together. But the next day, we got that call from the police.
John Smith's car was found at the bottom of a cliff.
I couldn't understand the meaning of the words immediately. What does that mean?
At the hospital, he was just brought in.
The rest of the words didn't register in my mind. I heard someone saying, "Mrs. Smith, are you listening?" from the other side, but I couldn't move. Seeing my state, Lydia took over the conversation. For a while, it felt like Lydia was dragging me everywhere. We went to the police, identified the body, and were given an envelope that had been in the glove compartment. A suicide note. When I opened it, there was a printed message inside. The contents was about not being able to bear the heavy responsibility of being appointed chairman and apologizing.
So the police have concluded that John took his own life?
No, we still have to perform an autopsy and other procedures, so the results will come later. We just wanted to show you this because we found it.
He would never kill himself, I shouted. He was always so careful, always telling us to be careful. I couldn't find the words to continue. The police told us they would contact us when they were ready to return John's body, and then they let us go home. The following days are a blur in my memory. The local news reported that it was unclear whether it was an accident or not, but they mentioned a suicide note was found and leaned towards the possibility that he took his own life. Angrily, I turned off the TV and my kids looked at me with worry.
When is Daddy coming home?
Nate is 8 and Emily is only 5. I'd kept them out of school and kindergarten for a while. I was truly grateful to have Lydia with me. My mind felt like it was covered with a thin veil, and everything seemed unreal. Then, 1 week after the car was found, a letter arrived with a specific delivery date.
Mary, this is for you.
Lydia handed it to me as I stared blankly. I glanced at the sender's name and my eyes widened. John? In a panic, I took the envelope and opened it with trembling hands. Inside, there was a letter and a key.
Read this without letting our parents find out.
Of course, I understood that. Even so, he probably wanted to write it that way.
This is something I prepared in advance in case something happened. If I'm there when you receive it, just laugh and give it back to me. But if I'm not, please, Mary, take what's in this locker and run to my uncle.
Lydia and I exchanged glances as we read. Then, hurriedly, we packed only the bare essentials, took the kids, and got into Lydia's car. My car had been in the shop since that incident. Driving a rental car to Ken's place in a neighboring state felt too risky. So I asked Lydia for help.
Leave it to me, but wear a hat and mask,
Lydia said with a smile. And then we just drove nonstop. We were on edge until we reached Ken's house in the next state. I knew security was nearby. But given what happened to John, I worried something might happen to the car. We contacted Ken during the drive to let him know we were coming. When we parked and rushed to the house, Ken and his wife, Julia, were already waiting to greet us.
Glad you made it, Mary and Lydia. John had told me to assign guards for you and eventually send you here, but I never expected it would come to this.
Thank you for taking us in. I'm sorry, but we had nowhere else to go. I thanked him sincerely. The kids, surprised by the large entrance, looked around wide-eyed.
It's fine. I never thought it would come to this. My judgment was too optimistic. I didn't think they would actually target John himself. Those bastards.
Ken clenched his fist in frustration. We were then shown into a spacious living room. It was a calm and warm room. Julia directed the housekeeper, who guided the children to a corner and brought them some snacks. Thank you so much.
It's nothing. You want to keep them where you can see them, right?
Yes, I didn't want to take my eyes off them even for a moment. But the conversation we were about to have wasn't something the kids should hear.
They have always been rotten to the core. Even if we tried to remove them from the group, it's hard to find concrete evidence. Letting them be has led to this mess.
It's not your fault, Ken. My parents were involved in this too. Both John and I had terrible parents.
If this is what it comes to, we should have adopted John sooner.
Julia said, almost to herself. Ken suddenly lifted his head.
That's it. Call the lawyer.
Ken?
I don't want those kids to end up like John.
Ken then made a proposal to me. Eventually, after the autopsy was completed, John's body was brought back to Ken's house. A private funeral and a memorial service within the group were planned. I attended as the chief mourner, bringing the kids with me. My parents were there as relatives, acting all solemn. John's colleagues and friends were all confused and saddened by his sudden death.
This is such a loss. John was such a good employee. We were looking forward to his future with the group.
Thank you. John would have been honored to hear that. I repeated similar greetings mechanically. John's friends and contemporaries, deeply affected by his sudden loss, shed tears. Everyone who knew John personally was genuinely good. After the memorial service, Ken gathered the family, in-laws, and executives at his house. The spacious garden and hall were crowded with people. In the midst of this, someone came rushing in.
Honey,
It must have been just in time. Lydia's husband, Adam, ran in, clutching his bag tightly.
Sorry I'm late, Lydia and Mary. I ran into some issues on my end, but it's good that the memorial service and the meeting were scheduled for today. It worked out.
Adam smiled slyly.
Here, I'm returning these to you.
He took a set of documents and a USB drive from his bag. Is everything okay now? They were from the coin locker indicated by the key we received earlier. When we took off in Lydia's car, we met up with Adam on the way, gave him the key, and had him copy and send the documents and USB.
You handed the copies to your lawyer, right?
Yes.
That's good. We needed the originals here.
I nodded deeply. At the meeting that began shortly after, Ken spoke to everyone about the recent events and expressed his deep regret over losing John, who had been the successor. After he finished that part of his speech, Ken continued.
This is truly, truly unfortunate. And there is one thing I think I was wrong about.
Ken called me and my 2 children over. The kids, surrounded by so many adults, looked scared and about to cry. I supported them from behind, reassuring them it was okay.
So, I have decided to name the next successors here. They are my new children, Nate, and Emily. They are John's children, but I have adopted them.
The room buzzed with murmurs about the kids.
Many of you are surprised, I'm sure. But I believe the tragedy occurred because I left John as just my nephew. Don't you agree?
With those words, the crowd's gaze turned towards my in-laws.
Ken, what are you saying?
Is it okay to say this here, Bob?
Oh, it's fine. He took his own life, didn't he? A suicide note was found. He just couldn't handle the expectations placed on him.
Really? It seems you have more to say.
Yes. So, you're making these kids your adopted children? Aren't you just putting more pressure on them?
Well, they're also your grandchildren, so maybe they won't feel that pressure.
Bob's face twisted.
John did not take his own life.
Ken said firmly. The room buzzed with whispers.
What are you talking about? A suicide note was found in the glove compartment.
No one has publicly stated that it was found in the glove compartment.
At that moment, Adam raised his voice, "May I speak?" and got Ken's permission.
Yes, go ahead.
Meanwhile, Bob continued his futile resistance.
Well, if it was found in the car, then
We, the police, did not leak that information to the media at all. In fact, Bob, you really had no interest in me, did you?
Adam pulled out his police badge from his suit pocket. Yes, he was a deputy inspector with the county police where we live.
gosh.
Bob was at a loss for words. Was he really that clueless? I was genuinely shocked. I had heard from Lydia that he hadn't been in touch since Adam got the job. They hadn't even properly informed him about their marriage. Still, wouldn't you at least be curious about your son-in-law's profession?
That's the kind of person he is.
Lydia muttered softly.
As a related party, all I could do was provide crucial evidence for the investigation.
Adam continued to explain. The police had been thoroughly investigating the car that was pulled from the cliff from the beginning. They had quickly noticed that the brakes had been tampered with. It seemed the tampering occurred when John mailed the date-specified letter.
That day, John first went to put something in a coin locker at the station. Then, he went to a convenience store in the station to mail a letter to Mary. That's why it took some time.
It was then that the brake system was tampered with. However, that alone wasn't enough to immediately determine anything.
After that, John was driving towards this house. But on the way here, there are some winding roads, right?
Small murmurs began to rise from the surrounding people. Many agreed.
That's when a car started tailgating him. Deliberately, of course. And these roads aren't always wide enough.
It's a common issue in rural areas where even well-traveled roads aren't always wide enough.
John was forced to lightly brake due to the tailgating, but eventually the brakes stopped working, and it was too late.
So that's what happened.
Ken asked solemnly. Though the words were vague, everyone understood the meaning.
Yes. The police identified the tailgating car from John's dash cam and have already apprehended the driver.
Adam said, smiling at the in-laws.
But what does that have to do with us?
It seems the tailgating driver was just a hired hand. The direct employer is still under investigation. However, Bob, you are going to be prosecuted for a separate matter.
A separate matter.
Yes, for the embezzlement you've been committing for years. John had been investigating this secretly. Here is the evidence.
Suddenly, various documents were projected on every wall from several projectors in the room.
For now, we are arresting you for the embezzlement.
Then, the doors behind us opened, and police officers entered the venue.
Anne.
Adam glanced at me briefly before turning to face another direction.
You there?
Us.
My parents began to rise from their seats.
There are arrest warrants for you for damaging Mary's car.
What? But we're family.
My mom exclaimed. I sharply questioned her. Parents who smashed their child's car window with a crowbar? And you're okay with glass shards falling on your grandchildren's heads? I glared at her with all my might and said, You're not my parents. My parents sank back into their seats. After that, my in-laws, who were arrested for embezzlement, confessed during interrogation to planning John's death, adding to their charges. My parents also faced charges for property damage and aiding in my in-laws' plan. The local media first leaked the story, and it was quickly reported by local newspapers and news stations. But it didn't end there. The sensational nature of the crime, combined with the fact that it was orchestrated by the parents themselves, made it national news, and it became fodder for talk shows. And in this digital age, their reputation was further tarnished by what is known as a permanent digital footprint. Even if they were released, I wondered what they could do next. But that was no concern of mine. Since then, we have been given rooms in Ken's house and are living here. Julia dotes on the two new children as if they were her own. She never had children of her own and now spoils Nate and Emily to a degree that might be excessive. But for now, I think that's okay. The kids, who just lost their dad, have had to transfer to a new elementary school and kindergarten. I feel sorry for involving them in adult conflicts. However, considering their safety, this seems like the best solution. As for Ken, he is determined to stay healthy until the kids are grown, and he continues his physical training every day. Everyone, tea is ready. I spend my days in this house taking care of the kids and keeping Ken and Julia company. I don't know how much help I am to them, but for the sake of the kids, I will continue to live my life to the fullest.